Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is David Steiner. I have the privilege to be the director here at the CUNY Institute for Education Policy. I want to thank all of you for rising at a good hour and joining us for this discussion. I'm going to speak very briefly, you'll be grateful to learn, just to set the scene. Many of you, most of you, perhaps all of you, will not need this introduction. But for what it's worth, here are, based on the state tests, the ELA, English Language Arts, proficiency rates for the last few years. You will see two enormous resets, one that took us from close to 70% proficiency back down to, in New York City, 42%, the rest of the state about half. That was when I was persuaded as commissioner that there had been enormous inflation in our test mechanisms, and had Dan Horace from Harvard take a look at it to confirm that in his research. And then again, as you can see in the last 2 years, when my successor, John King, realigned the tests to what would be an adequate performance at high school for entry into a community college without remediation. That was the standard. So what that's telling you is that about a third of the students in the 3 through 8 grades, we can confidently say would not be at a level of needing to be remediated for a first-year community college course many years later. We simply backward mapped. There's some debate about that, I want to acknowledge. These are not perfect metrics by any means. I don't think anyone has argued that they're massively off. That is, that in fact 3/4 of our students are absolutely prepared, for 4-year college work. Somewhere in between, there's plenty of room for debate. Speaking as a nation, you can see that these scores suggest essentially flat results for reading. We have exaggerated the scale. Any statistician will tell you you can make a line look like almost anything, depending on the way in which you organize the X and Y axis. But in fact, statistically, there is basically no variation. You can play billiards on these results. They are flat, flat, flat. And that is, of course, enormously discouraging if you have the view that where they are is dramatically lower than they need to be. You are not supposed to be able to read this, fortunately, because it makes very depressing reading. But let me summarize for you. Essentially, again, the United States results have been flat. They're actually a tiny bit down on the previous PISA rankings, statistically insignificant change. Whether you count China as 4 countries, 5 countries, or 1 country will allow you to place the United States 17th, 21st, or 22nd. None of those, of course, are particularly encouraging. Those are the international results. Again, plenty of debate. I want to acknowledge, is Shanghai, in fact, testing all the students that would be comparable to the students we're testing? We could have a whole conference on that. Indicative only. And then finally, and controversially, a pilot study done in New York City in the last couple of years under Joel Klein of the core knowledge results. Full disclosure, I'm on the board of core knowledge, and I want to say, sort of against myself, that there has been pushback on these results, that the sample sizes were very small, 10 schools as control schools. But for what it's worth, you can see that in this small pilot, the students using Woodcock-Johnson, the reading tests, were strongly outperformed the set. We can argue whether 10 schools is actually small, large, or medium. Again, some statisticians will tell you that that could be statistically significant, would argue that it was. Others will say otherwise. That by way of introduction, let me welcome you again and say one final word about what has happened in New York City. It's perhaps symptomatic of why we're here that an article by a rather experienced New York Times journalist, Javier Hernandez, almost exactly 2 months ago, which was a rather modest report on an interview with the new Chancellor, Carmen Fariña, was headlined, "New York School Chief Advocates More Balanced Literacy." If you actually read the piece, that's a strong title for what is in fact written. There are some quotations, none of which actually include the word balanced literacy, and it would be saying a lot to derive that title from what actually Javier says. So I want to be clear that this occasion is not imputing to the Chancellor any official policy on balanced literacy, because there has not been an official announcement about any change. There are a couple of anecdotal points that some of you will be aware of. For example, at this very moment, there is a middle school writing institute under the direction of Lucy Corkins's Reading and Writing Project, which is announced on their website as co-sponsored by the Chancellor. And there are a couple of instances in her school visits where she has made some indication of suggestions around a return to balanced literacy. But you can tell that that's reading tea leaves at a rather strangely absurd level to try and sort of deduce what might be coming. Let me just say, more importantly, that with this tiny little piece in this section of the New York Times, suddenly we had a huge explosion. One that's still going on, op-ed in the New York Times, pieces in Education Week, pieces on Fordham. It's as if this was the third rail, right? It almost doesn't matter what you say. As soon as balanced literacy goes on a headline, boom. And what's extraordinary is that this has been going on for year after year after year after year. So I wanted to invite folks here who really do know what they're talking about. Catherine Snow really needs no introduction. She's simply, arguably, the most eminent scholar of writing and reading, and particularly reading for young children, and has been for many years. Many of you know her work. Many of you know her work on the Research Council and since, highly influential already in the 1990s and since. It's been my privilege to know that work for many years. And I think probably represents the most thoroughly researched output of anyone in the country on early childhood reading. Susan Newman has been in the direct line of fire. She has been at the US Department of Education in the middle of all of this, in the middle of national policy. She has, like many of us who've been in policy, had the good sense to come back to academia because there's only so much of policy one can take. And she is now a professor at NYU. She has also written considerably on this topic, and in particular on the crucial need to combine the techniques of learning to read with content knowledge, which is something we will come back to. So we have an absolutely senior level policy perspective and scholarly perspective on this subject. At this point, I'd like to invite our speakers to join me. I'm going to begin by asking Catherine Snow to talk for about 10 minutes on really what's happened since her work in the 1990s. What's happened in terms of research, how she sees the development of reading education since then, how she responds to the results that I put up shortly earlier, put us really in the middle of this whole debate.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, David, for inviting me. Let me do a little bit of the deep history of this. So in 1995, a little under 20 years ago, I got a very unexpected call from the folks at the National Research Council, the operating arm of the National Academy of Sciences, in asking me to chair a committee called Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children. And I was a little puzzled by this request because actually in 1995, I had never done any research on reading instruction, on reading policy, I'd done some work on language development and pointed out that kids' language development segues into aspects of reading development, but I was really completely innocent of the field of reading research. And part of that had been intentional, because for many years, after I arrived at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in '79, I had an office next to Jean Chall, one of the great, the grande dames of the field, and I would hear her on the telephone yelling at people and being yelled at, and I thought, God, that's a horrible field. That's a field I would never want to be involved in. People are so nasty to each other. So I went to Washington to talk to folks about what this committee would be like and why I got chosen to chair it, why they were inviting me to chair it. And basically, they were trying to be polite about it, but basically it turned out that my primary qualification for being asked to chair this committee was ignorance-fueled neutrality. Because I had never written anything about reading instruction, I was the only person who had some vague knowledge of the field who wouldn't be seen as biased in chairing this committee. That's how fractured and aggressive and hostile and volatile that field was. So I naively said, well, sure, this sounds like fun. And the committee, as it got put together, of course, it was very important that it be balanced with people perceived as being affiliated with all of the different approaches to teaching reading, which could be those approaches could be very oversimplifiedly represented as whole language or phonics. So we had developmentalists on the committee who were very into emergent literacy approaches, Elizabeth Sulsby, Dorothy Strickland, Barbara Bowman, folks primarily interested in early childhood. And we had some real phonics proponents, Marilyn Adams, Chuck Perfetti, folks who came more from a cognitive or psycholinguistic perspective. And again, remember, I'm the kid who knows nothing about this field, and I'm sitting through these meetings thinking, I don't understand these conversations. They're actually not disagreeing with one another. They are emphasizing different aspects of the process of reading development, but they are not, nobody is saying it's wrong to teach kids about the alphabetic principle, and nobody is saying language and knowledge development are irrelevant to literacy. So the reading wars dissolved into, as perhaps many wars do, in my mind, dissolved into sort of a set of relative emphases rather than actual disagreements. And I think that got represented in the committee report, which basically said, well, kids all need opportunities to develop language and a knowledge base. They all need opportunities to grasp and master the alphabetic principle. They all need opportunities to read and be read to. They all need opportunities to learn to love reading, be motivated to read, be engaged in the process of reading. And throughout those 3 years that we spent writing the report, I kept thinking, who's going to be surprised by this, right? And in fact, I don't think anybody was particularly surprised by it, except for the fact that everybody across that broad spectrum of putative disagreement was willing to sign on to it, was willing to go out in public and defend it and promote it and support it. So one of the things we had to do in writing that report, I will say, is we had to avoid using terms like whole language, like balanced literacy. And I think that was probably a very good commitment on our part. It was a political decision, and we didn't want to raise any hackles. But at the same time, I think, and this is particularly relevant now to bringing us up to date with recent events in New York, I think terms like balanced literacy are they're slogans. They are not actually useful ways of characterizing literacy instruction. If you want to characterize literacy instruction, you've got to actually describe literacy instruction. I mean, nobody could reject the notion of balance in literacy. Balanced literacy, balanced checkbooks, balanced diet. It's a good thing to be balanced. But the question is, what is being balanced? What is it a balance of, and how is that balance measured, calibrated, and implemented? So you asked me, I don't know how many minutes I've used up, you asked me to comment on what's happened since. Nell Duke recently wrote a very informative little paper. It was published by the Princeton Future of Children series as an article in a volume, an issue devoted to literacy that Dick Murnane and I edited, in which she categorized the recommendations, the specific recommendations in preventing reading difficulties, and the degree to which they have been implemented. And it was in practice or in policy, and it was not altogether happy-making recapitulation of those recommendations, because, well, some of them have been implemented, and I think the one that perhaps has been most acknowledged in practice is the need for some attention to language development in early years, and the need and the lack of conflict between teaching code and teaching content. Many of the recommendations have in fact been pretty much ignored. And that brings me back to my distrust of policies that boil down to labels, right? Because it isn't about the labels. It's about what happens Monday morning in the first grade classroom. And you can call it anything and be doing something very, very good or something not so good. And what we need to do, obviously, is fill in what's underneath any of those labels with sufficient support for teachers, with sufficient guidance that what they're doing is coherent, integrated, and helpful to kids. And it doesn't matter what you call it.
We will come back to what has not been implemented, I'm sure, very shortly. But meanwhile, Susan, from your perspective as someone who was really in charge of critical federal policy as a scholar, how do you read what's taken us to where we are?
So I want to tell a little bit of a different story, because I'm the reading person. So when Catherine says there was no controversy about preventing reading difficulty, which is a wonderful report and something people should still read, was controversial. In fact, she gave a talk. I don't know if you remember this, Catherine. She gave a talk. And you know how usually people come and talk to you after the talk? It was fascinating because everybody sort of left. And she kidded me later and said, I wonder who I'm having dinner with tonight, because no one was going to talk about this. It was controversial. But then the next step was even more controversial, because a colleague of ours, Reed Lyon, decided that he wanted to go to Congress and ask for a quantitative analysis of what Catherine had done so beautifully. So Catherine had written this very comprehensive, along with her colleagues, lovely report called Preventing Reading Difficulty. But what the next series was called the National Reading Panel Report. And this was an attempt to quantify the skills that Catherine has just talked about in a bit. And there was a lot of controversy. In other words, what came out was a diet of what is reading. And there was enormous controversy and pushback on the basis of that. One of the things that came about as a result of that controversy was this term balanced literacy, where people said, it's not about phonics, it's not about whole language, it's about balanced literacy. But my premise today is that balanced literacy is not a reading program. It is a political confection. In other words, it was the design. We had a war, and it was a war. And what happened is we needed peace. And we needed to ensure that we were really teaching reading. And so what we said is, it's a balance. But the problem with the balance is that no one knows what a bounce means. So in other words, if I go in a particular class and I see a balanced literacy program, I see another balanced literacy program, I see smush. I don't see a strong theoretical understanding of what is good literacy instruction. So you might ask, I had that phone call that Catherine had as well. I was asked to come to the U.S. Department of Education. And I said, and one of the reasons I was asked is I wasn't into politics in any way. I was a professor at University of Michigan. But one of the things that I felt strongly about, and I still feel strongly about, is that reading should be based on evidence. And I would argue we have no evidence for a balanced literacy approach in this country, in this state. One of the things that happened when I went briefly, I spent 2.5 years at the Department of Education. We were in charge of taking the National Reading Panel report and putting it into legislation. And it became Reading First. Some of you know that. Some of you have been involved in Reading First. And in Reading First, what we attempted to do is take the evidence and put it into legislative language. And we did some very good things, I think. One of the things that we did is we said, you got to have evidence. We trust in God, but others bring evidence, right? So one of the things we said is we got to have data to show that we were making effect. Secondly, we said we need professional development for our teachers. That teaching reading is difficult, and we need ongoing professional development. Third, we also need differentiated time for our students. Some of our students need more time in instruction. And then we also need a systematic approach to instruction to ensure that many of our kids who are highly mobile are going to get a coherent, don't work. Mandates are not good things. So in other words, when we mandated that children should have 120 minutes of instruction, that's not necessarily smart for some of our children, right? So when we mandated that there should be a core reading program, that became a convoluted response to saying they should have a basal reader. And many of our basal readers are not good. So one of the things we did is we adopted a basal reader, and that was not necessarily a good approach for our students. Third, we also did, all our children need 5 skills. I'm almost done.
No,
5 skills.
I'm listening.
And phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And what we learned is a little bit of this and a little bit of that adds up to a bad recipe that you cannot recipe reading instruction, that you need to depend on the quality of that teacher who is teaching our children. So I want to just end by saying what I wish.
Please.
All right? My wish. I, after 14 years, am back in the East Coast, and man, it feels so good. I'm in the land of yeah rather than yes. I'm in the land of where we call everything fabulous, and I'm in the land of where I actually grew up and where I care so much about instruction. And what I see when I go to various schools throughout our city is I don't see a systematic plan for instruction for our children. I go to schools and I don't see that they're getting phonics at all. Yet we know that children need phonological awareness and phonics. I don't see that they're getting the kind of rigorous instruction that they are highly capable of seeing. And so that's my wish list before going on.
So I want to shift back for a moment, and there's an enormous amount there to talk about, just for a moment to your hanging point, if I may put it that way, that there were a number of elements in that report where, looking back over the last 15, 20, 25 years, you don't see implementation. Can you just finish that thought? Because
Sure.
It's obviously an important.
And let me point out, it was Nell Duke who actually did this analysis, and I agree with it. I didn't do it myself. Well, let me connect this though to the little historical pieces that we've heard. I do remember that meeting, Susan. And you were very nice because you were the only person who talked to me there. Even though you were probably undermining your own reputation with those folks by doing so. And I distinctly remember later that evening having to pick up some refrigerator salesman in the bar in order to have someone to chat with. Because by God, the IRA folks weren't going to talk to me.
IRA for the
International Reading Association.
I didn't want it to be confused with Irish politics.
Exactly. But what's interesting about that is that those people had not read the report. They were operating based on a sort of a theory about what the report was going to say. I didn't say the report wasn't controversial. I said within the committee there was really remarkably little controversy. You know, Elizabeth Soulsby and Marilyn Adams were going out shopping together. You know, they were good friends by the end of this. They were amazed to discover that it was a 3% difference in what they believed and not a 90% difference in what they believed. But I think what has not gotten implemented, as Susan points out, differs from school to school. In some schools, what hasn't gotten implemented, I think, I'll have to say, partly as a fallout of reading first, is the strong language component, because 120 minutes of literacy instruction was, by some people, stupidly interpreted as 120 minutes of text-focused instruction, rather than recognizing that language is part of literacy instruction, that being read aloud to is part of literacy instruction, that doing a little science experiment and writing up the notes about it could be part of literacy instruction. So people took those guidelines far too rigidly, and that has hollowed out the content from literacy instruction in the elementary grades, in the primary grades. I should say I've been working the last several years with 4th through 8th graders, and it's just breathtaking what urban 4th through 8th graders don't know. The stuff that if you give them something to read and it's about a topic like, I don't know, volcanoes or the Revolutionary War or George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, and they don't know anything. And you can't read at a 4th grade level without bringing background knowledge to bear on it. So the kids who've had the background knowledge, who've had conversations in kindergarten or in preschool or with their parents about those topics, they can bring to bear what they now on average have, which is word reading skills. So word reading skills, I think it's clear, have improved. Accuracy and fluency in word reading is probably better in the US now than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But if the word reading skills have been won at the cost of language skills and knowledge skills, am I not working? If they've been won at the cost of language skills and knowledge skills, then it's a very, very sad victory. It's a Pyrrhic victory.
Right. Thank you. If we go back to this point about it was a war, it wasn't a war, it became controversial, it's fragmented across classrooms. One thing that seems to be more and more evident in the literature, and you've just touched on it and you've written about it, is this conflict, if it is a conflict, between teaching these phonic skills, phonemic awareness, and the background content, as if these two things shall never meet. And one could be forgiven as an outsider for saying, well, isn't that yet a third element? So we've got the turn and speak, we've got the whole language issue, we've got the phonics and phonemic awareness, and now we've got content. And we're totally confused, right? What are we supposed to be doing in teaching reading?
Well, from my perspective, I work with little itty bitties, so I'm interested in early childhood in the very early years. And one of the things that we do is a great deal of building background knowledge. And this is where Catherine's point is so salient. Children develop background knowledge through oral language development and through being read to and having rich conversations about that content knowledge. So we have the sources available, and interestingly, those interact with our phonological skills. So when I'm teaching about rich oral language instruction, I'm teaching children about worms and all the interesting things that we can do and learn about worms, something that is deeply caring for children, then I'm also teaching some of the phonological skills that are just absolutely important in their language development. One of the things, I want to tell you just a little story of, I was in Bed-Stuy just recently, and we're doing a little experiment, and one of the things that we were looking at is growth in some of the phonological skills, knowing that they're going to really, really help our children when they develop vocabulary and also enable them to talk about their background knowledge more. And what we found is their initial skills, they know their alphabet. Oh boy, do they know their alphabet. They can cite it, you know, up and down and all around. And if you go into their rooms, there's alphabet all over the place. In other words, you know, alphabetitis. But what you don't see is any understanding of sounds and our language. So these children are not being talked to enough. And they're not being engaged in language enough. And language is the content conveyor for our young children. So I think that's an essential feature that we have to grapple with very, very early on in early childhood here in the city.
Do you want to add?
Well, yeah, let me say, it's really interesting if you think about this from the perspective of the task. What do kids have to learn? 26 letters, 44 phonemes in English, 250 spelling rules, 50,000 words. And what's the distribution of time in early childhood programs? Much more on the 26 letters than on the 50,000 words. So we just have to somehow really convey to educators I understand why people are teaching the alphabet. You can succeed at it. You can test it, and by gum, they all get 100. But and it's much harder to see progress in language skills and knowledge skills that those language skills index. But it's not, I do think we have to not focus too much in messages to early childhood educators about vocabulary, because the difference between the kids who go to kindergarten with 600 words in their vocabulary and 6,000 words in their vocabulary isn't just 4,400 words. It's all of those concepts that those words represent. It's being able to talk about worms and insects and volcanoes and continents and islands and emotions and interactions. And it's the content that's really important, and the words are the index for it.
But let me push back then on behalf of perhaps some members of the audience and those elsewhere. Is there some sense of responsibility from you as folks who are at least associated with pushing on phonics and phonemic awareness that are now coming to us and saying, whoops, what happened to the overall language, to the content, to the knowledge? Where did that go wrong? Because the message that seems to have been heard was alphabetic, was phonics, to the exclusion of the rest. How did that happen?
Well, I'm going to let Susan feel guilty about phonics and phonological awareness. Okay. And I'll feel guilty about vocabulary, about pushing vocabulary as an element of its own without unlinked to content. And I think now I would flip the message very strongly and say, don't worry about how many words the kids know. Worry about whether they know some stuff. It's hard to know how to talk about that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the right message. But I am totally innocent on the phonological. Susan and I together worked on a curriculum for early childhood.
That's right.
Remember, we had big fights about how much phonological awareness and how much vocabulary.
All right.
So go ahead. You do your mea culpa.
Phonological awareness is just one of our of one skill among many skills. And I certainly don't want to be known as the phonological person, because I'm more the content-rich person. I'm the person who says children go to school because they want to become experts at something. You know what I mean? look at the kid on the playground, and what you'll often find is that kid who knows a lot of stuff. He knows, my grandkid was an orca whale specialist. You may not think that's important, but the kids in his kindergarten sure did. And when they ever had interests and controversies about whether a shark or a whale was a mammal, marine mammal, they went to Benjamin. He was your go-to guy. But when he went to kindergarten and when he went on, I asked him, what have you learned today as you come back from school? It's the first day of school, and you know how those kids, they have their little backpack, you cry as they leave your home, they come back, and you ask, Benjamin, what did you learn? Because here's this orca whale specialist, and he says, I learned, And I said, well, what else did you learn? And he says, A. Now that's a sad story in my view, because we've taken those children who've wanted to be experts in a domain, and we have skilled them to death. So I understand balanced literacy and what it was designed to do. What it was designed to do is say children need skills, but they also need that rich content in order to implement those skills and make it meaningful. But the way it has been implemented many times has not been coherent in any kind of coherent strategy. And so what I see when I go to many of our schools is our children are not doing nearly as well as they can, but it's our fault. It's not theirs. They are perfect, in my view. It is the curriculum that is not perfect for them.
So I'm going to push back from both sides. The program that you were part of at the USDOE was based on empirical research, quite a lot of empirical research, that showed only 2 programs seemed to really move reading skills. One of them, as you recall, was direct instruction, and the other was roots and wings.
Direct instruction.
Direct instruction. Those programs are known to be very heavy in phonics and phonemic awareness. And the pushback and the politics, we have Saul Stern in the audience, he's written about this, is a messy story on its own that I don't think is necessarily pertinent for this immediate discussion. But isn't it true that if you look at the empirical research, and you spoke about this earlier, the emphasis on phonics and phonemic awareness was what the research was pushing. And this current and contemporary anxiety, and obviously this is part of the work that E.D. Hirsch has done and others around, whoops, what happened to knowledge? Where was that in the research, and why were we so driven by those 2 programs if in fact something very major was left out?
Well, I'll speak for the policy perspective. When I went to the government first, it was not a phonics program that we were pushing at all. We were pushing an emphasis on a core reading program. And the notion of a core reading program is basically that was a short cut to saying children need a coherent program. A lot of our kids are getting a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and as a result, a little bit of nothing. So we said at least a core reading program provides an anchor. And here's where we went wrong. And I go back to, you cannot just have a program that says phonological awareness goes to phonics, goes to fluency. It's not a causal model. Do you know what I mean? It's not a causal model. What happens very often is a little bit of phonological awareness feeds a lot of vocabulary instruction, which feeds building background knowledge, which feeds comprehension, because comprehension is so based on background knowledge. So for example, people Catherine was saying unintended messages. I think people interpreted that as silos of different skills, rather than say, no, teacher judgment is essential. We only teach the phonological awareness and phonics that we need in order to make the ha-ha-ha. You know what I mean? Once we get the aha, then of course what we do is we build on that. But people said, nope, 15 minutes of phonological awareness and that's it.
Every kid, every day. Every day, every kid.
So for those of us in teacher preparation, what are we getting wrong? Or putting it another way, if you were in charge of the early childhood program at Hunter College, and we put many hundreds of teachers into the New York City schools every year, and we are stressing clinical preparation and videotaping of students in the field and trying to really be thoughtful about what we're doing, and we didn't have any of this history, what should we be teaching the teachers?
Let me say, I think one of the big challenges in doing a good teacher preparation program is taking research results, all of which have their own limitations, and interpreting them, recognizing them, acknowledging them, but integrating them. I mean, I think if we're going to have a motto, if we're going to have a slogan for what we're doing, it shouldn't be balance, it should be integration. And the other motto I would propose to you is development, right? So two ways in which we've gone wrong. Susan mentioned one. People sort of said, all right, 15 minutes of this, 20 minutes of that, 15 minutes of something else. That adds up to a reading program, whereas in fact, those chunks that were being dealt with in separate 15-minute segments should have been integrated into the process of reading and understanding what was being read. What you do with a 4-year-old is very, very different from what you do with a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old. And yet the notion has been, oh, phonological awareness is good. Well, let's do it. Let's do it with very young kids. And if a kid at 5th grade is having trouble reading, let's do it with him too. This is insane. This is absolutely stupid, because it fails totally to recognize that reading is a developmental process, that there are sequences of accomplishments in that process, and that you can't treat these different skills as sort of being acquired in parallel. They're acquired in interaction with one another. So a good early childhood program would pick some really interesting topics. Fortunately, young kids are not very choosy about what they consider really interesting topics. And it would assemble, for the support of the teachers, dozens and dozens and dozens of resources about those topics, books and pictures and charts and maps. It would outline a sequence of oral language activities supplemented by shared writing activities about those topics. It would focus on ensuring the kids learn the words that are relevant to those topics. And of course, it would give the kids and the teachers opportunities to show how print helps you remember and document information acquired about those topics. And that's a robust program for 3-year-olds, for 4-year-olds, for 5-year-olds, for 6-year-olds, but then at 6 in 1st grade, you'd introduce more formal and systematic sequential phonics instruction for the kids who need it. It's developmental, and not all kids, some kids are already reading by then. They don't need to go back and learn ah is A is ah.
From a policy perspective, given the results that we are all too familiar with, where should we go at state and federal level?
We should get out. You know, one of the things that I have become since then is I recognize the overreach of No Child Left Behind. I mean, that was one of our clear messages. We should get out of teacher evaluation. We should get out of people's way so that they can begin to teach again. And one of the things that I feel very passionate about is I feel that our children deserve instruction. And I often go to schools and I see that our coaches, everybody is dealing, you know as well as I do in this city, they're dealing with testing and testing related issues. I want to see our less policy and more opportunity for our teachers to do the right thing. Do you remember the book, many of you might have read, Horace's Dilemma? It was a very salient book for me because what happened is this guy, Horace, who was a confection, but basically it was a teacher getting up in the morning and knowing the right thing to do, but then often with all these various mandates and all these requirements, couldn't do what they knew was essential for their children. And I think that that's what has happened in policy. We have become more and more and more. And what I'd like to see is I'd like to see a little bit less and less.
So let me push back and say this. At the one hand, I think rightly, you said a few minutes ago, when you go out into the classrooms, you see teachers trying to do the right thing, but what you see on the ground is a lot of fragmentation, a lot of non-integrated lessons, a lot of practice that very frankly is producing the results that we see. And you together have an enormous knowledge base, and so does many of your colleagues, about what would be a better reading instruction. But it's not happening. If you just pull off, if you step back, if you say, look, the state is always heavy-handed, the feds are always heavy-handed, they always unintended consequences, they never get it right, what gives you any confidence that the kind of model of instruction that you would want to encourage is actually going to take place?
I'm going to let Catherine take that on.
Well, what would give me some confidence would be good teacher preparation programs in which these principles of good instruction are infused, good professional development supports, investing in teachers, and as Susan says, withdrawing the mandates and the pressures that are interfering. I mean, that is unfortunately, the world is going in the other direction, I'm afraid, but it is really important, I think, for the public to realize how difficult it is for teachers to do the jobs for which they've been prepared. We've been working in 4 public urban systems in Massachusetts and Maryland, introducing a program for 4th through 8th grades that teachers love, that it's a content-based literacy program. They love doing it, and we go and we say, well, you say you love it, and you say the kids love it, and you say it's really productive, and the kids are reading better, and they're writing better. How come you only did 12 of the 24 units? Oh, they say, well, we had to stop in March for test preparation. We had to stop in April for test administration. We didn't have much time in May because there were mandated professional development days, so we didn't have a full week, any week of school in May. And by June, we're told kids are likely to be absent and our absenteeism rates are too high, so have parties every day. So the opportunity to instruct is undermined by our efforts to hold teachers and children accountable for the products of instruction. It's an absolutely insane dilemma. So I would do a testing amnesty. I would emphasize in professional development the vision of the Common Core and try to help people actually understand what the Common Core standards are all about, rather than letting it get reduced to close reading and complex texts, which is a tiny, tiny piece of it. And I would really emphasize in the Common Core that there's language and discussion, language skills there that we need to be focusing on.
So I'm not sure my question was answered, but and I'll say why. I think where there is absolutely world-class professional development of the kind obviously you're trying to provide, one could easily say, fine, the imposition of testing, of prescribed curriculum is getting in the way. Surely part of the problem is that professional development, that quality of professional development is rare. And so we've got a chicken and egg problem. Those of us in policy have been reluctant to pull back because we know how fragmented things are on the ground, and those on the ground tell us that the impositions are getting in the way of doing the right thing, and then we point to the fact that when the impositions weren't there, the right thing wasn't being done anyway. So we've got a complex knot to somehow untangle, and I'm not sure we've thought our way through it.
I don't either. I think that I would love to see this. Sometimes in the city when I see teacher training, and I feel like our notion of training is more of mandating rather than actually having teachers in a rigorous discussion of what is good instruction for our students here in New York. Our children here are different than in other places. We're blessed with enormous diversity, enormous language challenges and interests. And what we should be developing is a strategy for teaching that takes into account our blessings and recognizes that we are not like other places. I mean, we are different. I can tell you from being in Michigan that this is different here. But what we need is that discussion, and rather than mandates and saying how we do Common Core. One of the things that I'm terribly concerned about, I wish, I hope we have some conversation about, is the fact that whether or not the Common Core as defined, and I totally agree with Catherine, that has really been described, will exacerbate some of our achievement gap rather than actually close it. That we are doing things that are counter to what children actually need. Using texts that are so complex that our little ones are going home and crying to their parents because they cannot successfully complete these things. So I think what I would love to see is more of an open forum where we actually have discussion, where teacher voice is heard more deliberately, that we're told less and discussed more. I'd like to see that happen because we have a lot of very, very bright people in this city.
So last point, and then I'm going to hand it to the audience. Common Core. You've both mentioned it. One of Lucy Corkin's more outspoken recent utterances was a very directed critique of a lesson that David Coleman designed around actually a number of lessons he designed, but there was one on the Gettysburg Address that was the particular subject, and it was a very close reading. He's also done one on Letter from the Birmingham Jail. Again, very, very textual, no context. The idea is, really take apart the language. And the criticism was that was just not pedagogically appropriate. To what extent do you think that the Common Core really is a large tent, larger than the David Coleman hermeneutics, if I can put it that way, his way of reading, which we could discuss? And to what extent do you think one more time we're going to get driven in a particular direction with the Common Core as a matter of practice?
Oh, implementation is where it is, right? And it's going to get screwed up, of course. Like every other well-intentioned reform has been screwed up. But I would encourage people to step back and read it as it was intended by David Coleman the first, rather than as it was interpreted by David Coleman the second. It is a tremendously idealistic vision of what kids can do and what teachers can do. There's a huge emphasis in the vision, in the core of the Common Core, on integrating research with reading, with oral presentation, and with writing, on using reading for real purposes, not teaching kids to read in order to practice reading, but teaching kids to read in order to learn stuff, using different resources when they read, even in early grades, integrating, synthesizing, critiquing. That's what reading is all going to be all about. That is preparation for citizenship. And that's what we have to be teaching. But if it gets reduced to, you know, 7 years ago, and you don't know what year this was said, and therefore you don't know what 7 years ago means, even if you know what 7 years ago means, is ridiculous, is obviously insane. So it's the misinterpretation and the distortion of it that really bothers me. And I think close reading is a great thing for 1 sentence a day.
On that note, I'm sure you'll have a chance. I do want to get to the audience. Please ask a question. I know you've heard this 1,000 times. People feel very strongly about this topic. I know that. You know that. Please ask a brief question. Okay. And the microphones are coming around. Okay.
Oh, sorry. We have been losing the stuff in each of the pillars or silos. We know less about the teaching of decoding, teaching of word analysis, I think now than we did 30 years ago when I started, or 35. I think we need to pull together what there is as resources. And what you guys have done is provide an image of how that pulling together, but by discipline, by separate thing, vocabulary, phonics, comprehension, early language, that we need to be able to draw on these in some integrated way, rather than mandate a version of integration, okay? So that was what I got out of this. And now the question is some question related to that.
Let's keep going. I think that was a wonderful summary. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And this question is to both our guests, but probably particularly Susan Newman, since you were at the USDOE. The reading panel, with which I'm very familiar, the report of the reading panel, a major outcome of that was the response to intervention protocol. And so that hasn't come up in our discussion today. And that would take so much weight off of the regular classroom teacher if it were executed fully, which means any struggling child moves up a notch to more intervention, to more help, you know, from the struggling reader to the dyslexic reader. And we are asking, in my head, way too much of classroom teachers, especially TFA teachers with 5 weeks of training and no reading instruction. So my question to Susan in particular is, what happened to that piece? It has gotten so siloed with special ed and special ed funding. Why hasn't that become more mainstream?
Well, it's actually different legislation than the legislation of the National Reading Panel Report. National Reading Panel Report led to Reading First and No Child Left Behind, which was part of No Child Left Behind. RTI came a little bit later under IDEA legislation. But in my view, what I see in terms of RTI, it was a heuristic. It was a model that we should move toward. The problem is teacher time. Teacher time, and if you need students who have to give more time to intervention, which certainly is the case for some of our students, you tell me how you do that when you have 30 children in a class. You do that when you have distractions and whatever. So what we haven't done is develop a structure in our organization to allow for that kind of RTI to occur, and then to study it in a more deliberate way than I think we have in the past.
Next question. Go ahead.
Good morning. My name's Cheyenne Batista Sanghaki. I am a founding principal of a community-based charter school. We're in our 4th year, contending very much with our own schools of philosophies around what great reading instruction looks like and should feel like, but also contending with accountability measures and having to perform well on tests. I've brought my reading specialist with me. I've brought my dean of instruction with me. These are questions that are freshly in our mind. What advice do you have for school leaders? What should be our top priorities as if it is in the interest of having rich, comprehensive, cohesive, rigorous reading programs, but also have to prepare students for this, particularly close reading type tasks? What should we be prioritizing?
Well, personally, good reading instruction will prepare students for the few questions that require close reading more than a lot of close reading will. So I would say test preparation does not actually improve test performance. Ignore test prep. Think about instruction. And you've heard us both talk about what good reading instruction is. Good reading instruction starts with interesting things to read about and to talk about. Talk is part of reading instruction. Talking about topics, being read to about topics, then reading appropriate level texts about those same topics, integrating information, learning content knowledge, seeing reading as a tool and not as an end in itself. I think that's what good reading instruction is. If the kids can't read the words, then you have to teach them to read the words. If they can read the words, you can move on directly.
One additional thing I think that we haven't talked about yet, and that is every child has an instructional history. So one of the things that we have to be sure about is that what happens is not just a horizontal process of learning reading in a particular grade, but it's also a vertical process where we talk about the integration from pre-K to K to first to second. Now, we haven't talked about that well enough. And in my experience and what I see in our schools, there's too much variation that goes on in all of that. So in other words, a child could have a wonderful pre-K program, a totally different program when they go to K, a totally different program when they go to first. And this is okay for some of our children. They'll do okay, but others will not do okay. Every different grade level becomes a disruption for those children. So we need a coherence across and throughout.
Fair enough. Go ahead. God, Mike's coming, and then we'll get to you. Sorry.
In brief, what can we do to emulate countries that have better rankings? What are they doing that we're not doing?
Fair
And I know
question.
that I know the data is skewed. I
Well,
know.
the question was, what can we do when we look at the countries that do year after year very, very well on reading, what are they doing that we're not?
They're selecting teachers from the best applicants to university programs rather than from the bottom third of applicants to university programs. They're providing teachers much more time to learn on the job. They're spending fewer hours with students and more hours with colleagues, learning, observing one another, and improving their practice. They see reading as, teaching as really see it as a profession rather than as an hourly wage job.
Seems definitive. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. It is a shame that we don't have anyone here from Lucy Cocking's school, because this is really about balanced literacy. And she is the face of balanced literacy in New York.
So let me just quickly say I invited her, and I invited her colleagues. I don't want to impute anything. I want to be very accurate here. The response was that, and I had a very warm exchange actually with Lucy Corkins. She was not able to be here. Her colleagues were not able to be here. I hope that we've done a reasonable job of presenting the history and different points of view, but obviously we would have loved to have her here.
No, sure, but the thing is that the way that balanced literacy is really implemented in New York is really within the ELA class, and content is not really part of reading. all of the examples that you have both given are really content related, volcanoes, worms, etc., right? So it is really also, I think, of actually putting content, really driving all of the instruction in terms of language and in terms of reading. So it is not a question, but it is really mostly that what can we actually do in order to bring content into balanced literacy the way that it is implemented here?
Yeah, good.
I don't know. Someone should chat with Lucy.
I don't see reading instruction without content. So that's the difference for me. I don't see reading being taught as a skill apart from learning about things. So in other words, what I do is I start with 3-year-olds, and I say that the wonderful thing, if none of you ever work with 3-year-olds, you'll find that they tolerate nonsense much less than they do at the upper grade levels. You know what I mean? They get it. So in other words, if I say to them, they'll look at me and they'll say, what are you, nuts? So in other words, they get it. They really want instruction to be meaningful. And what we find is that very early on, when we teach them vocabulary, some of the phonological skills, alphabet, and we build their background knowledge, they understand now the purposes of reading. The purposes of reading are about knowledge gathering. They really are. And they get that early on. And that is not what they're getting in this city. They're often getting that it's a technical skill, that they have to go through this horrible process in order to one day find nirvana. That's not going to happen. It really is not.
Okay. Yes, Ellen.
Hi, I'm at Hunter College, and my question for both of you is, and I think it's great ideas that you've put forward to us, but for models of how we do pre-service and in-service training for our teachers once they're in the field and when they're being trained, do you have any specifics that you can offer us? Like, is it powerful to use a mentor model? Is it powerful to use exemplary videos of teachers doing a fine job of showing their stuff to our candidates? What are some of the models that you feel really work for our teachers?
Well, first thing I'd like to say that I think you guys are doing great at Hunter. I think the video library is just exemplary. I think one of the things where we have missed in terms of teaching teachers is the notion of teaching specific practices to our teachers and having them practice those practices. So for example, I come from a wonderful colleague, Deborah Ball, who focuses on high leverage practices. And you and I can say it's really important to teach vocabulary, but we also need to practice how we do that. And we haven't done that enough in teacher preparation. In other words, what we want to do is we want our teachers to come out of our institutions, Hunter, NYU, Harvard, and we want them to know how to do things, not just to be able to talk about them. And I think that's really critical. So for example, let's just take a quick example, having a discussion. Do you know how hard that is? But so knowing how hard that is, you and I need to practice that with children, to see that in video, and then to give it a go again and again so we get good at it.
At the back. Yeah, sorry.
Add something to that? I mean, I totally agree with that. But the other thing is to notice that it is ridiculous to expect that all those multiple practices that a teacher might have to implement in the context of a potentially unruly classroom are going to be practiced and skilled after 6 weeks of pre-service mentored experience. That we do have to see teachers as themselves in development, ideally provide much more support in year 1 and year 2 while they're learning those skills, and provide simpler tasks for them in years 1 and year 2.
Yes, very quickly, if I may just take the privilege. One of the great challenges I face as the dean at Hunter is we have 2,700 students learning to be teachers, and we run multiple programs. probably one of our finest is our residency programs, because precisely the teachers are there for a whole year learning the practice with experienced mentor teachers, with videotaping, with skills. It costs us about $55,000 a student. We cannot scale this, and we need help from the federal government, from the state government. We have not done teacher prep well. I think we just acknowledge that.
My name is Alex, and I'm a special ed teacher along with my colleague at a small middle school in the Bronx. And this question is directed towards Ms. Snow. You mentioned a program that everyone enjoyed from teachers to students, and we really want to know what the name of that program is.
Yes. You found it. You found the one.
Well, I didn't come here to advertise, but it's called Word Generation. Okay.
Yeah, was it fun for you? So, go ahead, and then we'll get to you. 1, 2. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. I'm coming from an adolescent literacy perspective, but it's so interesting to learn from the spectrum. So again, thank you. Mine's a two-part question, and it has to deal with all of this conversation around content and topics. So I'm curious about how are decisions made about the content and topics to be made, and in doing so, what way are we privileging some content over others? That's the first part. And the second part is, once we make those decisions, what are some practical approaches to teaching content without sort of doing that empty vessel model of lecturing and such? So how do we make the decisions, and then what are the ways in which we teach the content?
Go ahead.
I'm going to start with the little itty bit. I want to start with the little itty bitties and then move toward you. So how do we begin to privilege what particular content is taught? And in fact, it's interesting you raise that, because content has been very controversial over time. In our case, and this is where we start, and I'm going to move it to Catherine, but we focus on the content that children are going to need in order to be successful in science and math and social studies and fine arts. So for example, what we do is every child, one of the key things that we want the children to do is to learn about living things and to learn about some of the commonalities that all living things will need. This will feed into their knowledge of when they get to 3rd grade and 4th grade and learning about the science in those particular areas. We have children who are age 3 who talk about hypothesis. And actually can say that word. We talk about, during their playtime, they are in camouflage and they love to say that word. So that, in other words, we're teaching them some of the content components that they will need when they go on to Catherine's world.
Yeah, well, there's no point really, I think, in sitting here and prescribing topics, because there are state standards and there are district standards, and usually they're way too long. The lists are way too long. I would say ideally content would be organized around a few big ideas and the content that needs to be brought to bear around those big ideas. A big idea is anything that's discussable to which the teacher does not know the answer.
Last question, if I may. Sir, you have the...
Probably tell from all this gray hair, I've been in this business for a long time, this sixth decade, and at least the 6th meeting about teaching reading. Yes, it's been almost entirely wars. Wars. It's been so disturbing. I was hoping that today we would get the answers and we would finally know how to get out of all this. Anyway, here's my question. I gave up in despair, finally did a scientific study of one person, my wife. How did you learn to read so fast, May? Because she can read about 5 times as fast as I can do. She said, oh, that's easy. When I was a teenager, I became totally addicted to dime novels. And I read and read and read. You mentioned briefly the idea of practice, and it quickly switched. Well, the teachers need a lot of practice. The kids need to do reading. They have to read, or they're not going to learn to read. And when you pick out what do you want to read about, you can say, well, they need all this, science and everything. But unless the kids have some opportunity to start reading what they want to read about, they're not going to read and they're not going to learn to read. So I just think maybe because almost the entire today has been, what is the right method to teach reading? But if we focus and saying, how do kids learn how to read? They learn how to read by doing a lot of reading. How do we get kids to do a lot of reading? So I think quickly the question is not only can we make that shift, would that be a big help, but could this community schools project, which hasn't been mentioned yet today, that the mayor and the union say they want, could this be fried a way in which we not only have a lot of teachers who are well-trained and do all these good things that everybody disagrees about, say we need more time when kids can get together with other older kids and adults, trade ideas about reading, blah, 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 blah. Maybe if we just say, what can we do to get kids engaged in reading so that they will actually do all this practice they need to do? That would be something I think's been left out of today's discussion.
Right, I remember at the National Endowment for the Arts, the big read and our efforts, but very modest. What can we do?
I'll tell you why I read, and I think that it's something that we haven't adequately tapped. The reason I read is I'm interested in a particular topic. So in other words, a number of years ago, I became very, very interested in my own history. My family left Russia, went on to South Africa, and then finally ended up here because of pogroms and all that awful stuff. But I wanted to know, I wanted to understand my history. And so therefore I read and read and read. When we have a message of saying to the kids, read a lot, that's not a message. But when we say to the, what do you want to know about? What are you interested about? What drives you? What compels you? And read and do many other things related to that so you become an expert on that topic. So it's not just about reading. It's about knowledge and privileging an information economy, recognizing that these kids are going to have to know a whole lot, and the one source is reading, but there are other sources.
Well, I want to thank both of our speakers. I think this is really a modeling, if I may put it that way, of trying to do what the last questioner spoke of, which is to stop fighting and to be thoughtful about good reading instruction. We have to break some cycles about how unrewarding we've made aspects of the teaching profession. Other aspects are always miraculous. Break cycles of this shift from leaving everything alone when it's bad to massive interference and creating unwanted consequences, which are equally bad, all of which is chasing the fact that we don't professionalize our teaching profession in the best way, that is, the thoughtful way. So there are paths forward here, and I want to thank both these speakers tremendously for helping us to find them.